The chimes of time brings out the news. Another day is through. Someone slipped and fell. Was that someone you? You may have longed for added strength, your courage to renew. Do not be disheartened, for I have hope for you. You might be sitting there scratching your proverbial head and saying, you know, those words are familiar, but I just can't place exactly where I heard them. Just out of curiosity, since we feel a number, show me by raising your hands how many knows what those words consist of. Okay, I see one there. All right, let me go a little bit further, and this will probably help to clear it up. It is no secret what God can do, what is done for others, He'll do for you. With arms wide open, He'll pardon you. It is no secret what God can do. That's a song in our song book. And you'd be surprised who wrote that song. Now, this is secondhand information. I don't have a computer, so I didn't check it out. This is what I read. It was a country icon by the name of Jim Reeves. I know that name might not sound familiar to some of you, but if you know anything of the old-time performers on the Grand Ole Opry, Jim Reeves certainly ring a bell with it. He was popular back in the late 30s, 40s, 50s, and he wrote that song. It's my understanding that Mr. Reeves was a religious man, not a member of the church, but he was a good man and highly respected. He wrote that song according to my secondhand information. In the book of Hebrews chapter 11, we have here what is commonly called the Heroes Hall of Fame. Some of it calls it Hall of Faith, because the very first verse in Hebrews 11, it actually tells us the definition of faith. Now, faith is a substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So, in this chapter, we have many examples of people of faith who profited because of the miracles and the power and the compassion of God towards them. Truly, God is a great God. We're going to consider a couple of these individuals that we find in the Old Testament. And let's look at the three Hebrew children, as they're called: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is found in Daniel, the 3rd chapter, is where we're going to get our text from. And I think that you probably know the story already if you studied at all the story of these three individuals. Nebuchadnezzar was the king, and he had set forth a proclamation that he was going to build up an idol. And he said that when you hear a certain type of music, that everybody was to bow down to that idol. And if they did not, they would be cast into a fiery furnace. That's chapter 3, beginning verse 1, tells that story. And so at that time, there was some Chaldeans who had something against these three Jews, the Hebrews. And so they observed from the past that at a certain time, these three Jews would get down on their knees and pray to Jehovah God. And so consequently, they was watching them. And when the time came for the whole population to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar, this idol, they noticed that these three young men did not do so. Well, Nebuchadnezzar brought them before him and asked. And they said that they did not do that. And so consequently, they said that Nebuchadnezzar said, we're going to cast you into that fiery furnace. Verse 19 said he was full of fury, and he commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And so he commanded the mighty men, verse 20 of that 3rd chapter of Daniel, to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Verse 21 said that they complied, and they went ahead and they cast them into that furnace. And the furnace was exceedingly hot, so much so that the ones that cast Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into that furnace, they were consumed by that heat. It was so hot. And so consequently, they was waiting to see the consequences. And verse 25 said, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire. They have no hurt. The form of the fourth is like the Son of God. And out walked Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And verse 27 says that their body, the fire, the flames did not bother their bodies, or their clothes wasn't even burnt at all. They didn't smell like the fire had, consumed them at all. And so that convinced Nebuchadnezzar that their God was truly the God. And he sent a proclamation there in verse 29 that they should not go against the God of these 3 men whatsoever. And verse 30 says that the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. There again, it was a miraculous working by Jehovah God. Truly, it is no secret what God can do. And then another example that we want to look at, again, one that's very familiar to us. It's also found in the book of Daniel. And this is Daniel in the lion's den. Now, we've heard this story ever since our childhood and in our Bible classes and sermons. Daniel in the lion's den. In Hebrews 11, verse 33, it says there, talking about these heroes of faith that we mentioned, that they were some that worked righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions. That's the only time lions are mentioned, so it has to be in reference to this particular happening concerning Daniel. And you find this in Daniel, the 6th chapter. So if you're following, turn over a couple, 2 or 3 chapters to chapter 6 of Daniel. And you'll find here. Now, we don't have Nebuchadnezzar, but we have Darius, who has taken over as the king here. And Daniel was favored in his eyes, and he was the first of the prince. There were several princes, and Daniel was the first. So he was certainly exalted by Darius. If you remember, it's kind of like the story of Joseph, that he was exalted by the Pharaoh. He just realized that there was some quality in this young man, Daniel. So consequently, we find here that at a certain time, Daniel also was a man of prayer. But there were some people in this kingdom, some in high authority, because they was jealous and envious of Daniel and his position, they sought to some way, somehow convince Darius that he was going to be a negative influence upon his kingdom. And so he went ahead and Darius signed a decree here about at a certain time that the people was to bow down and to worship a false idol, just very similar to that of Nebuchadnezzar. But they found, verse 11, these men found Daniel praying and making supplications before his God. And so they went ahead and they told Darius in verse 13 here that you made this decree. But then here's Daniel, and he did not follow that decree. He bowed towards his God. And so because of the decree, Darius didn't want to do it. But because of the decree, in verse 16 of that 6th chapter, it says, they brought Daniel and they cast him into the dens of lions. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, thy God whom thou serve continuously, he will deliver thee. Some way, somehow, Darius, who was not a follower of Jehovah God, a worshiper of idols, but some way, somehow, he was convinced because of the life that Daniel lived, that his God was going to deliver him. Well,